The hiss of steam was the first thing to greet her, a long, sighing exhalation that seemed to drain the very life from the iron beast that had carried her across a continent. For 3 days, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels had been her only constant companion, a metallic heartbeat drumming against the vast, silent plains. Now, that heart had slowed, shuddered, and fallen silent. The world outside the grimy window, once a blur of ochre and sage, resolved into the sharp, sun-bleached lines of a place called Redemption, New Mexico territory. Mary Lou Bennett pressed a gloved hand to the cool glass, her breath misting a small circle. Redemption, the name, plucked from the hopeful letters tucked safely in her reticule, had sounded like a promise, a psalm sung in a new and golden land. The reality, as it now came into focus, was less hymn and more harsh, spoken word. She stood and brushed the travel dust from her navy serge skirt, a futile gesture. The dust of the West was a persistent, insidious thing, a fine red powder that worked its way into every seam, every pore, every hopeful expectation. It was the color of dried blood and sunset, and it coated everything in a uniform layer of weary acceptance. With a deep breath that did little to calm the flutter in her chest, she took hold of the handle of her worn leather valise. It was heavy, containing not just clothes and a few precious books, but the entire weight of a life left behind in Boston, a life of predictable gray skies, cobblestone streets, and the stifling quiet of a spinster's future. Stepping down from the carriage was like stepping into a furnace. The air was not merely hot. It was a physical presence, thick and dry, smelling of sun-baked earth, horse sweat, and something else, a faint, resinous scent of pine from the distant, hazy mountains. The station was little more than a wooden shack. Its sign, Redemption, painted in letters that were peeling like sunburnt skin. The platform was made of thick, warped planks that groaned under her sensible boots. And then she waited. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, scanned the handful of figures scattered near the tracks. A station agent, a gaunt man with a drooping mustache, listlessly tossed a mailbag onto a cart. 2 rough-looking men in dusty denims and sweat-stained hats leaned against the station wall, rolling cigarettes with practiced ease and watching her from under the brims of their hats. A woman in a faded calico dress, clutching the hands of 2 barefoot children, hurried past with her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, as if looking at a stranger was an invitation for trouble. None of them was Silas. She smoothed her gloves, a nervous habit. The letters had been so clear. I will be there on the platform when the Thursday train arrives. Mary Lou, you will know me by the blue wildflower in my hatband. I will know you by the hope in your eyes. She had thought it the most romantic thing she had ever read. Now, standing under the relentless glare of the New Mexico sun, it felt naive, a line from a cheap novel. Her gaze swept the area again, more slowly this time. There was no man with a wildflower. There were men, certainly, men whose faces were leathered by sun and wind. Their eyes narrowed into a permanent squint. They moved with a languid, deliberate economy that spoke of energy conserved against the oppressive heat. Their stares were more palpable than the heat, though, as the moments ticked by, she became the sole focus of the platform's quiet attention. She was an anomaly, a dark-colored bird that had mistakenly landed among a flock of brown sparrows. Her dress, so practical and modest in Boston, was here an emblem of the East, of a world of rules and paved streets that had no meaning here. It was too dark, too heavy, too much. The train gave a final, shuddering groan and began to pull away, gathering speed with a chuffing rhythm that sounded like a final, mocking laugh. With its departure, the last vestige of the world she knew was gone, leaving her utterly alone on this splintered platform, a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent landscape. The silence that descended was profound. It was broken only by the buzzing of a fly, the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the sudden, raucous laughter that spilled from the bat-wing doors of a building across the dusty thoroughfare. The saloon. Silas had written of it, dismissing it as a place of necessary commerce and little consequence. From where she stood, it seemed like the town's very heart, pumping a boisterous, chaotic energy onto the street. A piano, painfully out of tune, began to play a jaunty, tinny melody. With her hope beginning to fray at the edges, Mary Lou stepped off the platform and onto the street itself. There was no boardwalk here by the station, just deep, soft dust that puffed up in red clouds around the hem of her skirt. The town of Redemption was, essentially, one long street, flanked by a collection of flat-roofed adobe buildings and a few more ambitious two-story wooden structures with false fronts that tried, and failed, to give them an air of grandeur. Every step was an ordeal, not just because of the heavy valise, but because of the eyes. From the shaded porch of the general store, a group of old men sitting on mismatched chairs stopped their whittling to watch her pass. Their faces were impassive, but their eyes followed her every move. From the doorway of the mercantile, a woman paused, a sack of flour in her arms, her expression a mixture of pity and stern disapproval. A woman alone was a woman in trouble, or a woman looking for trouble. There seemed to be no third option in their minds. She could feel her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. This was not the welcome she had envisioned. She had imagined Silas, tall and smiling, taking her bag, his hand warm and steady on her arm. She had imagined him leading her down this very street, proudly introducing her as his intended, their shared future stretching before them like the endless blue sky. The reality was this lonely, humiliating parade past a jury of silent strangers. The street itself was a river of slow-moving life. A massive freight wagon pulled by a team of 10 weary mules rumbled past, its driver cracking a long whip and shouting guttural commands. Cowboys on horseback moved with a fluid grace, their mounts and their bodies seeming to be one entity. They, too, looked at her, their gazes lingering, some openly curious, others holding a hint of a smirk. She kept her chin high, her back straight, focusing on a point in the far distance where the dusty street dissolved into the shimmering heat of the plain. She would not let them see her fear. She would not let them see her heart breaking. Her valise felt heavier with each step, the leather handle digging into her gloved palm. She passed the blacksmith shop, the heat and the smell of hot metal washing over her. The smith, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, paused his hammering to wipe his brow with a forearm, his eyes missing nothing. She passed the land office, its window displaying crude maps of parcels and claims, promises of a new life for sale. She passed a dressmaker's shop, its window dusty and its display a single, sad-looking bonnet faded by the sun. Finally, she stopped. She stood in the middle of the street, a small island of navy serge in a sea of red dust. The sun beat down, and the silence from the porches and doorways was louder than the noise from the saloon. Where was he? Had the train been early? Had his horse thrown a shoe? Had there been some terrible accident? Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities, each more frightening than the last, because they were all preferable to the one. Cold thought that was beginning to solidify in her gut he simply wasn't coming. She looked at her valise, at the dust that now caked her boots and the hem of her dress. She thought of the small, tidy room she had left in Boston, the scent of lavender and old books. She thought of her sister's tearful farewell, her voice tight with worry. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? Mary Lou, it's a wilderness out there." "It's a future, Clara," she had replied, her own voice firm with a confidence she now felt slipping away like sand through her fingers. "It's a home." But standing here, under the scrutiny of an entire town, with no one to meet her and nowhere to go, she felt more homeless than ever before in her life. The hope that had carried her 2,000 miles had evaporated in the dry, unforgiving air. All that was left was the heavy valise in her hand, the weight of a broken promise, and the cold, hard reality of the West. She was alone. A breath, then another. Action was the only antidote to the paralysis of fear, with a resolve that felt brittle, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. Mary Lou picked up her valise and began to walk. She had a destination now, a place to direct her steps. In his last letter, Silas Croft had proudly announced his partnership in the Redemption General Mercantile, describing it as the very hub of the town's commerce and society. It was, he had written, the solid foundation upon which they would build their future. She found it easily enough. It was the largest of the wooden buildings, with a wide, covered porch and 2 large windows displaying a jumble of goods, everything from shovels and bolts of calico to sacks of flour and jars of horehound candy. The sign above, painted in bold, if slightly uneven. Black letters read, Redemption Mercantile, S. Croft and E. Parker, Props. For a moment, she simply stood across the street, gathering what remained of her courage. This was it, the moment of truth. She clutched the handle of her valise until her knuckles were white, took one last, steadying breath of the dusty air, and crossed the street. The bell above the door jangled a cheerful, almost mocking, welcome. The interior of the store was dim and cool after the glare of the sun, and thick with a complex smell of ground coffee, new leather, cured tobacco, and soap. A young clerk with a smattering of freckles across his nose looked up from where he was weighing out beans. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, taking in her formal Eastern attire before his expression settled into one of wary neutrality. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the reedy tenor of a boy not long into manhood. "Good afternoon," Mary Lou said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am here to see Mr. Silas Croft." The clerk's eyes flickered for a second, a brief, almost imperceptible glance towards the back of the store. "Is he expecting you?" "He is," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Of course he was expecting her, just not, perhaps, today, or perhaps not her at all. The clerk wiped his hands on his apron. "He's in the back, tallying a freight order. I'll tell him he has a visitor." He disappeared through a curtained doorway, and Mary Lou was left alone in the cluttered aisles. She ran a gloved finger over a bolt of blue gingham, the rough texture a grounding sensation. She could hear the murmur of voices from the back room. One, the boys, the other, a lower, more resonant tone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was the voice that had filled pages with promises, that had spoken of sunsets over the plains and a home filled with warmth and devotion. The curtain was pushed aside, and a man stepped out. He was not as tall as she had imagined. His letters had painted a portrait of a rugged pioneer, a man carved from the very rock of the West. The man before her was softer. His shoulders were narrow. His middle was beginning to thicken under a checkered waistcoat, and his hands, resting on the counter, were smooth and uncalloused. He had a neatly trimmed mustache, and his hair, a sandy brown, was carefully slicked down with pomade. He looked less like a frontiersman and more like a Boston banker who had gotten lost. His eyes, a pale and uncertain blue, scanned her from head to toe. There was no flicker of recognition, no dawning smile of welcome. There was only a deep, furrowed confusion, which quickly curdled into something else, annoyance. "May I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. The sound of it, so ordinary, so detached, was a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Croft," she managed, her own voice a whisper. "It is I, Mary Lou Bennett." The name hung in the air between them. Silas Croft's face went through a remarkable series of transformations. First, a jolt of genuine shock, his jaw going slack. This was followed by a wave of color that rose from his starched collar, flooding his face in a blotchy, guilty red. He shot a panicked look at the clerk, who suddenly became intensely interested in arranging a stack of tinned peaches. "Miss Bennet," he finally choked out, his voice a strangled rasp. He cleared his throat and tried again. I see. Please, step into my office." He held the curtain aside, not as a gentleman inviting a lady, but as a man ushering away an unwelcome complication. The office was little more than a cramped, windowless storeroom, smelling of stale cigar smoke and stacked high with crates and ledgers. He did not offer her a seat. There was only one, a stool behind a small, cluttered desk. He closed the curtain, plunging them into a claustrophobic gloom. "There must be some mistake," he began, refusing to meet her eyes, instead focusing on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. "The letter. I did not expect you so soon." The train arrived precisely on schedule. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, dreadful clarity. "As I wrote it would." "Yes, well," he fiddled with a pen on his desk, his smooth hands suddenly seeming clumsy. Things are different when seen in the plain light of day. Miss Bennet, letters, they can paint a picture that reality cannot always match." Mary Lou stood perfectly still, her valise a dead weight at her side. She felt as though she were standing on a precipice, the solid ground of her future crumbling away into nothingness. "I do not understand you, sir. You sent for me. You offered me your hand, a home. I have traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of that promise." Finally, he looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not love, not even kindness, but a frank, calculating assessment. He was looking at her the way he might look at a horse he was considering buying, checking for flaws. "You are not what I had envisioned," he said bluntly, the words falling like stones in the small room. The cruelty of it stole her breath. "Envisioned. A man has a certain picture in his mind," he went on, gaining a sort of desperate confidence now that the worst was said. "From your letters, I pictured someone softer, more delicate. This is a hard country, Miss Bennet. It requires a certain pliability in a woman, a gentleness." He was talking about her clothes, her posture, the directness of her gaze. He was talking about the strength that had propelled her across a continent by herself. The very qualities she was proudest of her independence. Her resilience were, in his eyes, her greatest failings. He had not advertised for a partner. He had sent for a possession, a demure accessory to his new life, and she had failed the inspection. "The woman you described in your letters," Mary Lou said, her voice dangerously quiet. "The woman whose independent spirit you so admired, whose courage in leaving her home you praised. That woman does not exist. Words on paper are one thing," he said dismissively, waving a hand. "The reality of a wife, a helpmate, that is another. You are a handsome woman. Miss Bennet, do not mistake me, but you have a boldness about you. It would not be suitable. People would talk." The betrayal was a physical pain, a hot knife twisting in her chest. Every word he had written, every tender phrase, every promise of a shared future, all of it had been a lie. He had built a fantasy in his mind, and when she arrived as a real, living, breathing woman, and not the phantom of his imagination, he had rejected her as casually as he might return a misdelivered package. "So I am to understand," she said, her voice now cold and clear as ice, "that your offer, your promise is withdrawn." He had the grace to look ashamed, but it was the shame of a man caught in a social faux pas, not the remorse of a man who had just shattered a life. "It is for the best, for both of us. You would not be happy here. You are not suited to it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather coin purse. "I will, of course, pay for your ticket back to Boston, and a little extra for your trouble. Let us be civilized about this." He held out a few gold coins in his pale, soft hand. That was the final, unforgivable insult. To have her journey, her hope, her humiliation reduced to a monetary transaction, to be dismissed like a hired girl. Mary Lou looked from the coins in his palm to his face. She raised her chin, and all the pride of her Bennett ancestry, all the strength she had summoned to make this journey, hardened in her eyes. "I would rather starve in the street, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that made him flinch. "Keep your money. You will find you have more need of it than I." Without another word, she turned, pushed aside the curtain, and walked out of the storeroom. She did not look at the freckle-faced clerk, who was now staring at her with wide, pitying eyes. She did not look at the shelves of goods that were meant to have been part of her new life. She walked straight to the door, her back as rigid as a fence post, and stepped out into the blinding, indifferent sun. The cheerful bell jangled her exit. She stood on the porch of the Mercantile, blinking in the harsh light. The world seemed to tilt and sway. The sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon piano, the rumble of a wagon all faded into a dull roar in her ears. She had no return ticket. She had only a few dollars of her own tucked away. She knew no one. She had nowhere to go. She began to walk, with no destination in mind. She just needed to move, to put distance between herself and the man in the store, between the woman she had been this morning and the woman she was now. She walked past the saloon, ignoring the leering stares of the men who lounged in its shade. She walked past the blacksmith, who nodded at her grimly, a silent acknowledgement of a pain he could see plainly on her face. She wandered to the end of the street, where the last of the buildings gave way to the vast, open expanse of the prairie. The land stretched out before her, immense and empty under a sky that was too big, too blue, too bright. It was beautiful, in a stark and terrifying way. It did not care about her broken heart. It did not care about her shattered dreams. It simply was. The hurt was a living thing inside her, a wild animal clawing at her insides. But beneath the pain, a new feeling was taking root. A slow, burning anger. Anger at Silas for his cowardice and his lies. Anger at herself for being so foolish, for believing in paper promises from a man she had never met. She had lost a future, a phantom future that had never really existed. But she had not lost herself. She had left Boston to escape a life of quiet desperation, of being an unmarried woman slowly fading into irrelevance. She would not trade that for this public humiliation. She would not be the woman who was sent back. She turned and looked back at the town of Redemption. It was a harsh, dusty, unforgiving place. It was a town that had, in the space of an hour, taken everything from her, but it was also the only thing she had left. The sun was beginning to dip towards the mountains, painting the edges of the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and distance. It was a lonely sound, but for the first time that day, Mary Lou Bennett did not feel entirely defeated. She felt the wind on her face, saw the raw beauty of the sunset, and clutched the handle of her valise. She was wounded, betrayed, and utterly alone. But she was not broken. The sun bled out across the horizon, setting the dust motes ablaze in the long, slanted beams of light. Mary Lou sat on her valise at the edge of town, a solitary mourner at the funeral of her own future. The anger that had propelled her from Silas Croft's store had cooled, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of despair. The street behind her was growing quiet as lamps were lit in windows, casting warm, yellow squares of light that only emphasized her exclusion. Each lit window was a home, a life, a place she did not belong. She had nowhere to go. The station agent had already told her the next train east wouldn't be for 2 days. The town had no proper hotel, only a boarding house that, the agent had added with a meaningful look, was not for ladies. She had imagined a small, tidy room, a warm meal, the comfort of a hand in hers. Instead, she faced the prospect of a night spent on a bench at the train depot, a public spectacle of failure, the wilderness, which had seemed so vast and terrifying from the train window, now pressed in on all sides, a living presence full of rustles and strange cries as the day died. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She drew her shawl tighter, though the air was still warm. She was watching the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the jagged purple mountains when she heard a sound distinct from the wind and the town's fading hum. It was the steady, unhurried rhythm of a shod horse walking on hard-packed earth. The sound grew closer, and a figure resolved out of the twilight haze. A man on a dark horse, leading another, a fine-boned mare the color of pale buckskin. He was coming in from the hills, riding toward the town she felt so desperate to escape. He rode easy in the saddle, a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He wasn't a boy playing at being a cowboy. The land had shaped him, worn away everything that was unnecessary, and left a core of lean, quiet strength. As he drew nearer, she could see him more clearly. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, outlined against the fading sky. He wore a plain, dark hat, its brim pulled low, and a dusty jacket over a simple cotton shirt. There was nothing remarkable about his attire, yet he possessed a kind of elemental grace, a stillness in motion that was captivating. He wasn't looking at her, his attention on his horses and the road ahead, but she felt his presence as a disturbance in the heavy air of her solitude. This was Caleb Hart. He had spent the last decade of his life pushing cattle up from Texas, living by the seasons and the stars, his only home, the vast, open range. But the long drives were changing, the land being carved up by wire and homesteads, and he'd felt a change in himself, too. A weariness of the constant movement, a longing for a piece of ground to call his own. A year ago, he'd used his savings to buy a small patch of land up in the foothills, a place with good water and grazing, and had begun the slow, hard work of raising and breaking horses. He supplied mounts to the army at Fort Union and to the ranches that were springing up across the territory. His work was his life. It was honest. It was hard. And it was his... He saw her as he approached the livery stable. It was impossible not to. A woman dressed in dark, heavy Eastern clothes, sitting perfectly still on a suitcase as if she were a statue erected to commemorate lost causes. He'd heard the whispers already when he'd been in town for supplies that morning. A mail-order bride had arrived for Silas Croft. He'd seen Croft in the mercantile, preening like a banty rooster, and had taken an instant dislike to the man's soft hands and shifty eyes. Seeing this woman now, alone and abandoned as the town settled in for the night, he felt a slow, quiet anger stir in his gut. It was a damn poor way to treat anybody, let alone a woman who had crossed the country on a promise. He swung down from his horse in a single, fluid motion, his boots making a soft thud in the dust. He looped the reins of both horses over the hitching rail in front of the livery, his movements economical and sure. He ran a hand down the buckskin mare's neck, murmuring something too low for Mary Lou to hear. For a moment, she thought he would just go about his business and leave her be. It was what everyone else had done. But he didn't. He stood by his horses for a long moment, not looking at her directly, but she knew she was the reason he was hesitating. Then, he turned and began to walk toward her. Her first instinct was to flinch, to draw into herself. Every man who had looked at her today had done so with either pity, scorn, or a vulgar curiosity. She braced herself for more of the same, but his approach was different. He didn't saunter or swagger. He walked with a quiet purpose, his steps even and his gaze, when he finally lifted it from under the brim of his hat, was direct and strangely gentle. His face was weathered, browned by the sun and etched with fine lines at the corners of his eyes. They were gray eyes, the color of a cloudy sky over the plains, and they held a deep, steady calm. He wasn't handsome in the way Silas Croft was handsome. There was nothing soft or polished about him. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight, serious line, He looked like a man who didn't speak unless he had something to say. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to talk without raising his voice, but far enough to respect her space. He took off his hat, a gesture of ingrained politeness, and held it in his hands. His hair was dark and thick, unruly from the hat. The world had shrunk to this small circle of dust around them. The last of the light seemed to gather in this one spot. Mary Lou looked up at him, and the carefully constructed wall around her heart, the wall of anger and pride, suddenly felt fragile. The kindness in his eyes was more devastating than all the scorn she had endured. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She was so tired, so hungry, so utterly lost. The script she had been rehearsing in her mind for months, her arrival, her meeting with Silas. Their first conversation was a useless, tattered thing, but her mind, exhausted and strained, clung to a single, nonsensical fragment of it. A question she was supposed to ask, a cue for the next scene to begin. The words left her lips before she could stop them. A breath of sound in the quiet evening. Am I late? The question was absurd. Late for what? The life that had been denied her, the dream that had died. She was speaking to a complete stranger, a dusty cowboy with kind eyes. But in her disoriented state, he was the only other actor on this desolate stage. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look confused. He simply looked at her, and a slow change came over his face. The serious line of his mouth softened. A faint light, a flicker of understanding, came into his gray eyes. It was as if he understood that she wasn't asking a question of logistics, but one of existence. Do I belong here? Is there a place for me? Have I missed my chance? He gave a slight nod, and a smile touched his lips. It was a small, quiet smile, but it transformed his weathered face, erasing some of the harshness and revealing a surprising warmth. Right on time, the cowboy said. His voice was low and steady, a gravelly baritone that was as comforting as the solid earth beneath her feet. The simple words, spoken with such gentle conviction, were a balm to her shattered spirit. Right on time, not too late, not a failure, not an inconvenience. The world, which had been spinning out of control, seemed to settle back onto its axis. Something inside her broke free, not a sob, but a release, an instinct she didn't understand and couldn't control. She rose from her valise, her body moving without conscious thought. She took a step toward him, her legs unsteady, and lifted a hand. She didn't know what she intended to do, perhaps to steady herself, perhaps to thank him. Her gloved fingers brushed against the brim of the dark felt hat he held in his hands. It was a fleeting, feather-light touch. The felt was rough, coated with the fine dust of the trail. The gesture was shockingly intimate, a breach of every rule of propriety she had ever known. But in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was a connection, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity in a place that had shown her none. His smile didn't falter. His gaze held hers, and in the depths of his calm, gray eyes, Mary Lou Bennett saw not a reflection of her own despair, but the first, faint glimmer of a different kind of hope. It was not the bright, fanciful hope of letters and promises, but something quieter, stronger, and infinitely more real. It was the hope of a single, unexpected kindness at the end of the worst day of her life. The seed had been planted. For a long moment, the world consisted of only two things: the stranger's quiet smile and the rough, dusty felt of his hat beneath her fingers. The touch was broken when Caleb gently drew his hat back, his gaze never leaving her face. The spell was broken, and the cold reality of her situation rushed back in. But the crushing weight of despair had lessened, replaced by a fragile flicker of something she dared not name. "You can't stay here, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that was both gentle and firm. "The night gets cold, and this ain't no place to spend it." Mary Lou drew her hand back, folding it with the other at her waist. "I have no other place to go." The admission was quiet, stripped of all pride. He nodded, as if this were the most expected thing in the world. He didn't ask why. He didn't press for the sordid details of her abandonment, a story he seemed to already know without needing to hear it. This silent acceptance was a greater gift than he could know. "I have a place," he said simply. "Up in the hills. It's a horse ranch. There's a woman there, Martha Riley. She helps run the place. She has a good heart, under all the bark. She'll see you have a warm meal and a safe bed for the night." He paused, putting his hat back on his head and setting it firmly. "It's not charity. You can work it off. Martha can always use another pair of hands." The offer was plain, practical, and devoid of pity. It was a lifeline. Mary Lou looked from his steady, gray eyes to the dark shapes of the horses, then back again. In Boston, she would never have dreamed of accepting such an offer from a stranger, a man of the wilderness, but Boston was a lifetime away. Here, the rules were different. Survival was the only rule that mattered. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I accept." He gave another brief nod, then turned to her valise. "I'll take this." He lifted the heavy bag as if it were a child's toy, his strength effortless. He secured it behind his saddle on the dark horse. "The mare's gentle," he said, gesturing to the buckskin. "You can ride her if you've a mind to." Mary Lou looked at the horse, then down at her heavy serge skirt and impractical boots. I think I would prefer to walk." A hint of a smile touched his lips again. "As you wish. It's a couple of miles." He didn't argue or insist. He simply took the reins of both horses in one hand and began to walk, leading them away from the town and toward the rising darkness of the foothills. Mary Lou fell into step beside him, her valise blessedly gone from her tired arm. They walked in silence. The last vestiges of twilight gave way to a deep, star-dusted dark unlike any she had ever seen. The sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, so clear that the Milky Way was a shimmering, silvery road across the heavens. The sounds of the night prairie were all around them, the chirp of crickets, the mournful call of a distant coyote, the soft sigh of the wind through the dry grass. It should have been terrifying, but walking beside Caleb Hart's quiet, solid presence, it felt strangely peaceful. He was a part of this landscape, as natural as the rocks and the sagebrush, and she drew a measure of comfort from his stillness. After what felt like an hour of steady climbing, she saw a light ahead, a single yellow lamp glowing in the darkness. As they drew closer, the light resolved into the window of a long, low cabin built of rough-hewn logs. Nearby, the larger, darker shapes of a barn and several corrals stood silhouetted against the starry sky. The air here was cooler, smelling of pine, horses, and wood smoke. A dog began to bark, a deep, booming sound that echoed in the quiet hills. A moment later, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the hard-packed earth. A woman stood framed in the doorway, holding a lantern high. She was stout and gray-haired, her face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a long, hard life. She wore a simple, practical dress and a canvas apron. This had to be Martha Riley. "Caleb, that you?" Her voice was raspy but strong. "Took you long enough." "Had business in town, Martha?" he called back. The dog, a large, shaggy hound, bounded toward them, then stopped, sniffing the air and letting out a low growl at the sight of Mary Lou. "Hush, Bear," Caleb commanded quietly, and the dog fell silent, though it continued to watch her with wary eyes. As they stepped into the pool of light from the doorway, Martha's gaze fell upon Mary Lou. Her eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, took in every detail: the dusty, out-of-place dress, the exhausted pallor of her face, the faint tremor in her hands. It was an appraisal that missed nothing. "Lord have mercy," Martha breathed, her sharp eyes flicking to Caleb for an explanation. "This is Miss Bennett," Caleb said, his voice even. She's in need of a place to stay. I told her she could work for her keep." Martha looked from Caleb back to Mary Lou, her expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, she said nothing. Mary Lou felt her stomach clench. To have come this far, only to be turned away. Then, Martha gave a world-weary sigh that seemed to come from the soles of her worn boots. "Well, she can't stand out there all night attracting wolves. Get in here, girl. You look like you're about to fall over." She turned and shuffled back inside, leaving the door open in invitation. The inside of the cabin was one large room, dominated by a huge stone fireplace where a pot of something simmered, filling the air with a savory aroma. A long plank table with benches stood in the center, and a small area partitioned off by a curtain presumably served as Martha's sleeping quarters. It was rustic and simple, but it was immaculately clean and radiated a sense of warmth and order. "There's stew and cornbread," Martha said, gesturing toward the fire with a ladle. "Sit, eat, we'll talk after." Mary Lou didn't need to be told twice. Caleb set a bowl and a piece of cornbread before her at the table, and she ate with a hunger that bordered on desperation. The stew was thick with beans, potatoes, and chunks of savory meat, and the cornbread was coarse and warm. It was the most delicious meal she had ever tasted. Caleb and Martha ate with her, their silence a comfortable, accustomed thing. When she was finished, Martha took her bowl. "You sew?" the old woman asked abruptly. "Yes," Mary Lou replied, surprised. "Yes, I do." Martha nodded. "Good. The boys are always tearing their clothes to shreds on brush and wire. And there's leatherwork needs doing. Harnesses, chaps. Think you can put your hand to that?" "I can learn," Mary Lou said, lifting her chin. "You'll do more than learn. You'll work," Martha stated plainly. "There's mucking out, hauling water, helping me in the cookhouse when we have extra hands breaking horses. Room and board ain't free, girl. You earn it here." "I understand," Mary Lou said, "and I am grateful." Martha studied her for another moment, then gave a curt nod. "There's a small room off the back. Used to be for storage. Got a cot and a clean blanket. It's yours. Caleb will show you." She turned her back, beginning to clean the pots with a brisk, no-nonsense efficiency that signaled the conversation was over. The room was tiny, barely big enough for the narrow cot and a small crate that served as a table. A single, small window looked out into the darkness. Caleb brought her valise in and set it on the floor. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "It's Caleb," he said. "Martha will call for you before sunup. Get some rest." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "She's not as hard as she sounds." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the small, safe space. She sat on the edge of the cot, the rough wool of the blanket under her hands. She was no longer Miss Bennet of Boston, the prospective bride. She was a hired hand on a horse ranch in the New Mexico territory. She had fallen so far from the life she had planned. And yet, for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt a sliver of peace. Here, there were no false promises. There was only work. And in work, there was a strange kind of dignity. Her new life began before the sun had even crested the hills. Martha's call was a sharp rap on the door, and by the time Mary Lou had dressed and emerged, the old woman already had coffee boiling and bacon sizzling in a cast-iron skillet. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the endless demands of the ranch. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to fine embroidery, were plunged into the harsh reality of frontier labor. In the mornings, she helped Martha. She learned to make coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, to bake pans of cornbread that were light on the inside and crusty on the outside, and to keep a massive pot of pinto beans simmering over the fire, ready for any hungry man who passed through. Her afternoons were spent with a needle and thread, but the work was a world away from the delicate stitchery she'd known. She sat on the cabin porch, a basket of mending at her side. She patched tears in thick denim trousers, the needle protesting as she forced it through the tough fabric. She learned to use an awl and waxed thread to repair leather chaps ripped by thorny mesquite, her fingers fumbling at first, then growing sure and strong. She sewed buttons onto flannel shirts with coarse, heavy thread, her stitches small and neat, a tiny remnant of her old life applied to the fabric of her new one. Caleb was a constant, quiet presence. He was up before her and worked long after she retired to her small room. She would watch him from the porch as he worked with the horses in the corral. He moved with a patient, almost silent language that the animals seemed to understand. There was no cruelty in his methods, only a firm, gentle pressure until the horse yielded its will to his. He spoke to them in low murmurs, his hands always calm and steady. He rarely spoke to her directly, but his awareness of her was evident in small ways. One morning, she found a low stool beside the porch door, perfect for her mending. That hadn't been there the day before. When she struggled to haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, he would appear as if from nowhere, take them from her without a word, and carry them to the cabin. She, in turn, began to take extra care with his mending, ensuring the patches on his work jacket were doubly reinforced, the seams on his leather gloves stitched tight against the winter that was coming. It was a silent conversation, a dialogue of deeds, not words, that slowly began to build a fragile bridge between their 2 disparate worlds. Her body ached in ways she had never imagined. Her back, her arms, her legs, every muscle protested the unaccustomed labor. Her hands became red and chapped, then calloused and strong. She was often so tired by the end of the day that she would fall onto her cot and be asleep in moments. But it was the clean, honest exhaustion of a day's work well done, and with each passing day, the ghost of Silas Croft and his perfumed letters faded a little more, replaced by the solid reality of the smell of wood smoke, the feel of rough fabric under her fingers, and the quiet satisfaction of earning her own way. She was no longer a woman waiting for her life to begin. She was living it. A month passed, the days bleeding into one another in a steady rhythm of work and exhaustion. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden, hazy warmth of early autumn. Mary Lou felt the change not just in the crispness of the morning air, but within herself. The raw wound of Silas Croft's rejection had begun to scar over, leaving a tender but resilient tissue of self-reliance. The ranch in the foothills, once a desperate refuge, was starting to feel like the only real home she had ever known. She had found a quiet purpose in the endless cycle of chores, her body growing strong and her mind blessedly occupied. This fragile peace, however, existed in the bubble of Caleb's land. The town of Redemption lay waiting down in the dusty basin, a place she had not set foot in since the day of her arrival. But supplies were running low, and Martha announced one morning that a trip to the mercantile was unavoidable. "You're coming with me, girl," the old woman stated, not asked. "It's time you showed your face. Can't hide up here forever. Folks'll talk more if you act like you've got something to be ashamed of." Mary Lou's stomach tightened into a cold knot. The thought of walking that street again, of facing the pitying and scornful eyes, of potentially seeing Silas, was a daunting prospect. But she saw the hard-won wisdom in Martha's words. Hiding was a form of defeat. "All right, Martha," she agreed, her voice firmer than she felt. The wagon ride into town was a slow descent back into a world she had tried to forget. As they neared, the familiar sights, the peeling sign of the train depot, the false-fronted buildings, the ever-present red dust seemed to mock her. When Martha pulled the mule team to a halt in front of the mercantile, Mary Lou felt 100 pairs of eyes on her before she had even climbed down from the wagon seat. The whispers started immediately. They were a low, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across a boardwalk, but they were as sharp as shards of glass. She could feel them more than hear them. A woman sweeping her porch paused, her broom still, her lips moving as she spoke to her neighbor. A group of men lounging outside the saloon fell silent, their lazy amusement replaced by a focused, assessing stare. This was a different kind of scrutiny than she had endured on her first day. Then, she had been a mystery, an object of curiosity. Now, her story, or rather, the town's version of it, was known: Silas Croft, in an effort to salvage his own pride, had been diligent in painting his own narrative. He had told his business partner, Elisha Parker, who had told his wife, who in turn had told the entire town, that the woman from the East had been a disappointment, uncouth, overly bold, not at all the gentle creature he had been led to expect. He claimed, done the honorable thing by sending her away with her return fare, but she, in a fit of pique, had refused it. And now, the story went, she had latched on to the reclusive Caleb Hart, a man who kept to himself. The implications were clear and ugly. As Mary Lou and Martha stepped onto the boardwalk, the whispers grew more distinct. There she is, the abandoned woman, shameless, living out there with him, and her, a spinster from the East. Martha Riley ought to know better than to take in such baggage. Mary Lou felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She focused her gaze on the door of the mercantile, her back straight, her hands clenched at her sides. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Martha, for her part, seemed oblivious, her craggy face set in a stern mask as she pushed open the door, the bell announcing their arrival with its familiar jangle. The store was busy. Several women were gathered around the dry goods counter, their shopping baskets on their arms. They fell silent the moment Mary Lou and Martha entered. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. At the center of the group was a woman with a pursed, disapproving mouth and sharp little eyes, Mrs. Parker, the wife of Silas's partner and the unofficial queen bee of Redemption's small society. Silas Croft was behind the main counter, measuring out coffee beans for a customer. He looked up, and his eyes met Mary Lou's across the room. A flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or just annoyance at her presence crossed his face before he masked it with an air of dismissive superiority. He gave her a curt, almost imperceptible nod, then deliberately turned his back to her, busying himself with the coffee grinder. The public snub was as deliberate as a slap in the face. Mary Lou's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, pretending a deep interest in a display of tinned goods. Martha, however, was having none of it. She marched directly to the counter where Mrs. Parker and her friends stood. "Ladies," Martha said, her voice a low growl. "Got a list of goods as long as my arm. Best make way." The women shuffled aside, but Mrs. Parker held her ground. "Martha," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we were so worried about you. It must be such a burden, taking on strays." She let her sharp little eyes drift over to Mary Lou. "The only burden I have is a lack of salt pork and molasses." "Delia," Martha shot back, unfurling her list. "Something you can help me with, or are you just here to block the light?" Mrs. Parker let out a small, offended gasp. "Well, I was merely expressing Christian concern. For a woman to be in such a precarious position, alone, dependent on a man who is not her kin, it is a sad state of affairs." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, meant for Mary Lou. She could feel the stares of everyone in the store, could feel their minds turning over the salacious possibilities. She was no longer a person. She was a topic of gossip, a cautionary tale. But as she listened, the humiliation began to curdle into a cold, hard anger. These people, who knew nothing of her, who knew nothing of Caleb Hart's quiet decency, were sitting in judgment. She turned from the tinned goods and walked calmly to the counter. Standing beside Martha, she looked directly at Mrs. Parker. Her sea-storm eyes were clear and steady. "My position is not precarious, Mrs. Parker," Mary Lou said, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent store. "I earn my keep with my own 2 hands. There is no shame in that." The directness of the confrontation startled the woman. "Well, I never," she sputtered. "And Mr. heart. Mary Lou continued, her voice unwavering, has shown me more Christian kindness and decency in 1 month than I have seen from this entire town today. Now, if you will excuse us, as Martha said, we have a long list. She turned to the young clerk who had witnessed her first devastating encounter with Silas. We'll need 20 pounds of flour to start. Please, she said, her tone businesslike and calm. A stunned silence fell over the store. Mrs. Parker, her face blotchy with indignation, gathered her friends and swept out of the store in a rustle of skirts and righteous fury. Silas Croft kept his back stubbornly turned, but Mary Lou could see the rigid set of his shoulders. She had not only defended herself, she had defended Caleb, and in doing so, had drawn a line in the sand. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. As they left the town behind, Mary Lou felt the tension drain out of her, leaving her feeling shaky but strangely triumphant. You did good, girl, Martha said gruffly, not taking her eyes off the mules. Let 'em talk. A dog's bark is worse than its bite. Long as you don't show it, you're scared. Caleb was in the corral when they returned. He looked up, his gray eyes assessing their faces. He didn't ask how the trip went. He didn't need to. He saw the weariness in Mary Lou's eyes, the faint traces of the battle she had fought. Over the next few weeks, he began to change his routine. If supplies were needed, he would announce he had business in town anyway and take the list himself. When a traveling blacksmith was due in Redemption to shoe the horses, Caleb arranged for the man to come up to the ranch instead, paying him extra for the trouble. He was building a wall around her, not of logs and stone, but of his own quiet foresight, shielding her from the town's petty cruelties. One afternoon, however, a trip was unavoidable. A crucial part of a harness had broken, and only the mercantile stocked the specific rivet needed to fix it. Martha was down with a feverish chill, so Mary Lou knew she had to go. When she said as much, Caleb simply nodded. I'll ride with you. He said it wasn't an offer, it was a statement of fact. They rode into Redemption side by side, Caleb on his dark horse, Mary Lou on the gentle buckskin mare. The effect of his presence was immediate and profound. The whispers didn't cease entirely, but they were quieter, more furtive. The stares were still there, but they were tinged with a new respect, or perhaps fear. Caleb Hart was not a man to be trifled with. His silence held more weight than another man's threats. He moved through the town with an air of calm authority, a man completely at home in his own skin, and his confidence was a shield for her. Inside the mercantile, Silas was once again behind the counter. The store was empty save for the clerk. When Silas saw them enter together, a nasty smirk touched his lips. Mary Lou ignored him, going directly to the section where the leatherworking supplies were kept. As she searched for the rivets, Silas spoke, his voice loud in the quiet store. Well, if it isn't Redemption's most industrious couple, he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. Finding the work to your satisfaction, Miss Bennett. Caleb, who had been examining a display of axes, turned his head slowly. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Mary Lou. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes before she could hide it. He said nothing. He simply walked to the counter where Silas was standing, his spurs making a soft, metallic chime on the floorboards. He laid the axe he was holding on the counter with a heavy, deliberate thud. Then, he placed his right hand flat on the wooden surface, just inches from Silas's own soft, pale hand. Caleb's hand was a testament to his life. It was broad, the knuckles scarred, the palm and fingers thick with calluses from the reins and ropes and hammers. It was a hand that knew work, a hand capable of both immense gentleness with a horse and devastating strength. Silas froze, his eyes fixed on that hand. The silent, potent message was clearer than any shouted threat. Caleb never even looked at him. He simply stood there, his presence filling the space. A silent, immovable guardian. Find what you need, Mary Lou, Caleb asked, his voice perfectly level, as if nothing were amiss. "Yes," she said, her voice a little breathless. She brought the small packet of rivets to the counter, placing them well away from Silas, near the young clerk. The clerk, his eyes wide, quickly tallied the purchase. Mary Lou paid, and Caleb picked up his axe. He gave a slight nod to the clerk, turned, and walked out of the store. He never once acknowledged that Silas Croft was even in the room. Mary Lou followed him out into the sunlight, her heart hammering. He had not raised his voice, not spoken a single angry word, but in that one silent action, he had defended her honor more completely than any flowery speech ever could. He had met ugliness with quiet strength, and the ugliness had faltered. As they mounted their horses to ride home, he reached over and gently brushed a speck of dust from her sleeve. His calloused fingers barely grazed her arm, but a jolt of warmth shot through her. It was a small, simple gesture of care, and in that moment, Mary Lou knew she was no longer the abandoned woman. She was a woman who had, against all odds, found someone to stand beside her. The news of the annual harvest dance and supper arrived at the ranch on a crisp October morning, carried by a young boy on a pony who delivered a hand-printed flyer to Martha. The event, a tradition celebrating the end of a long, hard season of work, was the social centerpiece of the year in Redemption. It was a time for families to gather, for ranchers to negotiate deals, for cowboys to spend their pay, and for the whole territory to let out a collective, weary sigh of relief before the onset of winter. Martha tacked the flyer to the inside of the cabin door. "You'll be going," she announced to Mary Lou, her tone leaving no room for argument. Mary Lou, who was kneading dough for the day's bread, stopped, her flour-dusted hands suspended over the bowl. "Me, Martha, I don't pay you to think," the old woman cut in gruffly. "I pay you to work, and right now, I'm telling you your work is to get cleaned up and come to a dance. It's not right for a young woman to lock herself away like a hermit. You've earned a night off. Besides," she added, her sharp eyes softening almost imperceptibly, "it's time you showed them you're more than just Croft's cast-off or Hart's charity case. It's time you showed them Mary Lou Bennett." The word struck a chord deep inside her. For months, she had defined herself by her work, by the strength in her hands and the ache in her back. She had built a new life from the ashes of the old one, but it was a quiet, private life. The idea of facing the town, not as a victim, but simply as herself, was both terrifying and deeply appealing. It felt like the final, necessary step in her own personal reconstruction. But the thought of what to wear sent a wave of anxiety through her. Her dark, heavy Boston dresses were symbols of a woman who no longer existed. They were garments of mourning for a life she didn't even miss anymore. To wear one would be to step back into the past. That afternoon, she went through the small trunk that held her few remaining personal possessions. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a bolt of fabric she had bought on a whim in Boston. A moment of uncharacteristic frivolity. It was a simple sky blue calico, printed with a delicate pattern of tiny white flowers. At the time, she had thought it too cheerful, too bold. Now, holding it up in the dim light of her small room, it seemed perfect. It was the color of the vast New Mexico sky on a clear day, the color of hope. For the next week, every spare moment was devoted to the dress. After the supper dishes were cleaned and Martha was nodding by the fire, Mary Lou would work by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Her fingers, now calloused and nimble from mending rough denim and leather, moved with a new purpose. This was not work for wages. This was work for herself. She drafted her own pattern, simpler than the fussy, restrictive styles of the East. The dress would have a modest, high neckline, long sleeves, and a full skirt that would allow for movement. It was a practical design, but in the beautiful, hopeful fabric, it felt elegant. Each stitch was an act of defiance. Every seam she sewed was a thread pulling her further away from the humiliated woman who had stood on the train platform. She was not just making a dress, she was crafting a new skin, one that fit the woman she had become. Caleb watched her work, though he never said a word. He would come in late from the barn, smelling of horses and hay, and would sit quietly in the shadows, cleaning a piece of harness or sharpening a knife. His presence a silent, steady counterpoint to the soft snip of her scissors and the whisper of the thread. She felt his eyes on her sometimes, a calm, considering gaze, and it didn't make her feel self-conscious. It made her feel seen. On the evening of the dance, she washed her hair in the basin, using the harsh lye soap, but rinsing it with water in which she had steeped a handful of dried chamomile from Martha's small herb garden. She brushed it until it shone in the lamplight, then pinned it up in a simple, elegant coil at the nape of her neck. When she finally put on the dress, it felt like a transformation. The blue calico was soft against her skin, the fit perfect. She looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror on her wall. The woman looking back was a stranger, and yet more herself than she had ever been. Her face was leaner, tanned by the sun. Her eyes, which had held so much fear and uncertainty, now held a quiet, steady light. There was a strength in her posture that had not been there before. She stepped out into the main room. Martha looked up from the novel she was reading and peered at her over her spectacles. The old woman's gaze was critical, thorough. She looked Mary Lou up and down, then gave a single, curt nod. "It'll do," she said. Coming from Martha, it was the highest of compliments. Caleb was not there. He had ridden out early that morning, saying something about a stray mare, and had not returned. A pang of disappointment, sharp and unexpected, went through her. She had not let herself think, not even for a moment, that he might go to the dance. He was not a man for such things. Still, the thought of facing the town without his silent, solid presence at her back was a daunting one. The town hall was ablaze with light and noise. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm, flickering glow over the crowded room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, coffee, and sawdust. A makeshift band, consisting of a wheezing fiddle player and a young man on a guitar, was playing a lively tune. The room was a swirl of color and movement, the entire population of Redemption and the surrounding ranches packed into one boisterous space. When Mary Lou and Martha entered, a familiar hush fell over the conversations nearest the door, a ripple of silence that spread through the room. The whispers followed, and the stares were as sharp as ever. She saw Mrs. Parker holding court in a corner, her face a mask of sour disapproval. She saw Silas Croft, dressed in a new, fancy waistcoat, laughing loudly as he stood with the mayor's pretty, vapid daughter. He glanced their way, his eyes skimming over Mary Lou with a flicker of surprise before he dismissed her with a smug turn of his head. For a moment, her newfound confidence faltered. She felt like a fraud in her sky-blue dress, an outsider playing a part. She and Martha found a spot along the wall, and Mary Lou accepted a cup of lukewarm punch, her hands trembling slightly. She felt horribly, painfully conspicuous. The music started up again, and couples began to fill the dance floor. Young cowboys, scrubbed clean and awkward, stomped through waltzes with ranchers' daughters. Married couples moved with a more sedate, comfortable rhythm. Mary Lou watched them, a lonely ache in her heart. She was a wallflower, an outcast, just as she had feared. And then the door to the town hall opened. Caleb Hart stood framed in the doorway. He paused for a moment on the threshold, his tall frame silhouetted against the dark night sky, and every head in the room turned. He was not the dusty, work-worn man they were used to seeing. He had shaved, the clean line of his jaw sharp and firm. His dark hair was damp and neatly combed. He wore a clean, dark blue cotton shirt, the one she had mended so carefully, and dark trousers tucked into boots that had been polished to a dull shine. The transformation was startling. He looked younger, more formidable, and devastatingly handsome. His gray eyes scanned the crowd, ignoring the gaping stares, the nudges, and the whispers. They passed over everyone, the mayor, Silas, Mrs. Parker, as if they were invisible. His gaze swept the room until it found her, and it stopped. He began to walk. He moved with his usual unhurried, deliberate grace. But tonight it held a different quality. It was the walk of a man with a singular, unshakable purpose. He cut a straight path through the crowded room, the sea of people parting before him as if by an unspoken command. He did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed only on her. Mary Lou's heart began to hammer against her ribs so hard she thought it might break free. She could not breathe. The entire room seemed to be holding its collective breath. The fiddle player, caught off guard, let his bow screech to a halt, and the room fell into a shocked, absolute silence. Caleb stopped directly in front of her. He took off his hat, holding it in his hand, just as he had on that first night. Up close, she could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and leather. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low and clear, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. He held out his hand. "Would you care to dance?" It was not a question so much as a declaration. Mary Lou looked from his outstretched, calloused hand to his steady, gray eyes. In them, she saw no doubt, no hesitation. She saw only a calm, quiet certainty that pulled at her, that answered the deepest, unspoken question in her own heart. Slowly, as if in a dream, she placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. A collective gasp went through the room. She saw Silas Croft's jaw drop. She saw Mrs. Parker's face freeze in a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Caleb led her to the center of the empty floor. He put his other hand gently on her waist, drawing her closer. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such purpose. The contact was electric, sending a tremor through her entire body. She placed her free hand on his shoulder, the muscle there hard and unyielding beneath the clean cotton of his shirt. He nodded to the stunned fiddle player. "A waltz," he said, his voice calm but resonant with command. The fiddle player, jolted out of his stupor, quickly began to play, the melody hesitant at first, then growing stronger, and in the center of the room, surrounded by the astonished eyes of the entire town of Redemption, Caleb Hart and Mary Lou Bennet began to dance. He was not a polished dancer. His steps were simple, basic, and she, flustered and overwhelmed, stumbled at first, but he held her firmly, his grip sure and steady, guiding her until their movements found a shared rhythm. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at her. "You look beautiful, Mary Lou," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear. It was the first time he had ever used her given name. The sound of it, spoken in his deep voice, was more potent than any compliment she had ever received. A warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading through her limbs, chasing away the last of her fear. She looked up at him, into the depths of his calm, serious eyes, and she smiled, a real genuine smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. The whispers, the stares, the judgments of the town, they all faded away into an insignificant hum. They did not matter. Nothing mattered but the solid strength of the man who held her, the simple, beautiful melody of the waltz, and the undeniable truth that was unfolding between them, wordlessly, in the center of the dance floor. This was more than a dance. It was an announcement. It was a beginning. The harvest dance marked a profound shift, not only in the quiet, unspoken relationship between Caleb and Mary Lou, but in the social landscape of Redemption itself. Their waltz in the center of the town hall had been a silent declaration, a gauntlet thrown down in the face of gossip and prejudice. In the weeks that followed, The town was forced to recalibrate its understanding of the woman they had labeled. She was no longer just the abandoned bride. She was Caleb Hart's chosen partner, and his reputation, as solid and unyielding as the granite hills where he lived, afforded her a new, albeit reluctant, measure of respect. But for one man, the dance was not a beginning, but an intolerable insult. Silas Croft had watched the spectacle with a mounting fury that curdled his blood. He had dismissed Mary Lou, cast her aside as unsuitable, a flawed piece of merchandise. To see her not just surviving, but respected and even admired on the arm of a man like Caleb Hart was a direct assault on his fragile ego. It reframed his rejection of her not as a prudent choice, but as a colossal misjudgment. He, a man of commerce and burgeoning influence, had been publicly upstaged by a quiet, dusty horseman. It was a humiliation he could not, and would not, abide. Silas was not a man to engage in fistfights or direct, violent confrontation. His weapons were money and influence, and he had been diligently cultivating both, using capital from his family in the East. He had recently purchased the sprawling Circle C Ranch, a huge tract of land whose previous owner had been ruined by drought. Overnight, Silas Croft transformed from a small-town merchant into one of the territory's most significant landowners. He was now a man of property, a cattleman with a seat on the Stock Growers Association, and his voice carried a new, heavy weight in the affairs of redemption. And he intended to use that weight to crush the small pocket of happiness that was flourishing in the hills above the town. The pressure began subtly, a series of seemingly unrelated misfortunes. The livery stable in town, which had always been a reliable buyer of Caleb's well-trained cow ponies, suddenly found their stalls were full. The stable owner, a man named Henderson, couldn't quite meet Caleb's eye when he explained it. Then, the quartermaster at Fort Union, who had a standing contract with Caleb for cavalry remounts, sent a letter questioning the stamina and breeding of his stock, citing an anonymous but well-regarded local source. It was a clear warning shot. Caleb absorbed these setbacks with a grim, quiet stoicism. He knew their source. He spent more time in the saddle, riding further afield to find buyers for his horses, his face growing leaner, the lines around his eyes deeper. He never spoke of it to Mary Lou, but she saw the worry in the tense set of his jaw at the end of a long, fruitless day. She saw the way his gaze would linger on the horizon, toward the vast lands that now belonged to the Circle C. The social pressure on her intensified in lockstep. Silas, now allied more closely with the town's self-appointed moral guardians like Mrs. Parker, worked to ensure Mary Lou was completely isolated. On a rare trip into town for threads she couldn't do without, she was met with a wall of cold shoulders. Women she had seen at the dance now turned their backs as she passed. The clerk at the mercantile, once friendly, now served her with a clipped, fearful efficiency, his eyes darting nervously toward Silas's office in the back. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts, designed to make her feel so unwelcome that she would simply break and flee. But Mary Lou was no longer the fragile woman who had stepped off the train. She had survived betrayal, had learned the deep satisfaction of hard labor, and had felt the steadying strength of a good man's hand in hers. She met their scorn with an unshakable, quiet dignity that infuriated them more than any outburst would have. She would make her purchases, her voice calm and polite, her head held high, and walk out of the store without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. The conflict, however, could not remain one of whispers and backroom deals. It was destined to come out into the open, and it did so on a bright, cold afternoon in late November. A crucial wagon axle had broken, and Caleb needed the help of the town blacksmith to forge a repair. It was a job that couldn't be done at the ranch, knowing what a trip to town meant. He tried to go alone, but Mary Lou was adamant. "You are not facing them for me," she had said, her chin set in a stubborn line. "We are in this together. I will not hide." Her use of the word "we" hung in the air, a simple, powerful acknowledgement of their unspoken bond. Caleb had looked at her, a long, searching look, and then had given a single, slow nod. "All right, Mary Lou, together." As they rode into redemption, the tension in the air was palpable. The town seemed to be holding its breath. They left the wagon at the smithy and were walking toward the mercantile to buy coffee and flour while they waited, when a voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. Well, now, look what the wind blew down from the hills. Silas Croft stood on the boardwalk in front of his store. He was not alone. Flanked by two hard-faced men with the Circle C brand on their chaps, he radiated an aura of smug, confident power. He had been waiting for them. Caleb stopped, his body instinctively moving to place himself slightly in front of Mary Lou. He said nothing, his gray eyes calm and watchful. Silas smirked, his gaze raking over Mary Lou with open contempt. "Still trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear? Hard I'd have thought you'd have tired of my leavings by now." The insult was crude, designed to provoke. Mary Lou flinched as if struck, and she felt Caleb's entire body go rigid with a cold, controlled fury. His hand, which was hanging loose at his side, slowly curled into a fist. "Your business is with me, Croft," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "Leave her out of it." "Oh, but she is my business," Silas retorted, taking a step forward, his men moving with him. He was enjoying himself, playing to the audience of townspeople who had begun to gather at a safe distance. "You see, we're trying to build a respectable community here. We have standards, a man of property, a man who contributes to the prosperity of this territory, has a right to a say in those standards, and a woman of her questionable character, shacking up with a horsebreaker in the hills? Well, that just doesn't meet the standard. She doesn't belong here." He directed the last part to the crowd, his voice taking on the tone of a righteous crusader. He was using his power to turn his personal vendetta into a matter of public morality. "And if you persist in standing with her," Silas said, turning his full attention back to Caleb, "perhaps you don't belong here either. Grazing rights can be disputed. Water access can become complicated. A man with a small, unregistered operation like yours is vulnerable. Heart, very vulnerable." It was a direct threat, a clear declaration of war. He was threatening to ruin Caleb, to take away the livelihood he had spent years building with his own two hands. The silence that followed was heavy, fraught with the anticipation of violence. Everyone expected Caleb to launch himself at Silas. It was the way of the West. An insult like that, a threat like that, was typically answered with fists or something more final. But Caleb did not move. He simply held Silas's gaze, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. He was a man who had faced stampedes, prairie fires, and the mindless violence of trail towns. Silas Croft's posturing did not intimidate him. "You can threaten my land, Croft," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You can threaten my water, but you don't get to threaten her." It was then that Mary Lou stepped out from behind him. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was a point of cold, sharp clarity. She would not be a prize to be fought over. She would not be the silent, cowering victim in this drama. She had found her voice in this hard land, and she would use it. She walked forward until she was standing beside Caleb, facing Silas directly. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fearless. "This has nothing to do with standards, Mr. Croft, and you know it," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This has nothing to do with the town, or grazing rights, or Mr. Hart's horses. This has to do with you." Silas's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You did not send for a woman of independent spirit, as you wrote in your letters," she went on, her words precise and damning. "You sent for a reflection of your own vanity. You wanted a demure, pliable creature who would adore you and make you feel important. When a real woman arrived, a woman who had crossed a continent on her own strength, you took one look at her and your courage failed you. You are not angry because I was unsuitable. You are angry because I was not an echo of your own self-importance." A murmur went through the crowd. She was speaking a truth that was plain to see. "The life I have now," she said, her gaze shifting for a moment to Caleb, a world of feeling passing between them, "is an honest one. I am more proud of the calluses on my hands from a day's work than you will ever be of the deeds to land you did not earn. Your money and your power cannot purchase dignity, Mr. Croft, and they cannot intimidate people who possess it." She fell silent. She had said her piece. She stood beside Caleb, two solitary figures bound by a shared, quiet strength, facing down the wealth and prejudice of the town's most powerful man. Silas Croft was left speechless. His face was a mask of puce fury. He had expected tears, fear, a violent outburst from Caleb. He had not expected this calm, unassailable dignity. He had been publicly dissected and exposed, his petty motives laid bare for all to see. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, no longer seeing admiration, but a new, speculative curiosity. His power play had backfired spectacularly. "This isn't over," he snarled, a weak and empty threat. He turned abruptly and, with his two hired men trailing behind him like shadows, stormed back into his store. The crowd began to disperse, the people talking in low, excited tones. They had just witnessed a new kind of showdown, one fought not with guns, but with character. Caleb looked down at Mary Lou. There was a fierce pride in his eyes, a deep and profound respect that was more intimate than any kiss. He reached out and, in front of the entire town of Redemption, he took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through hers. "Let's go home, Mary Lou," he said. Their public stand against Silas Croft bought them a fragile peace, but it was the peace of a Cold War, not a truce. Silas, thwarted and humiliated, retreated into a simmering silence. But his power was a palpable presence that loomed over Redemption like a thunderhead that refused to break. The townspeople, caught between the quiet dignity of Caleb and Mary Lou and the overt power of Silas, settled into a state of wary neutrality, waiting to see which way the wind would ultimately blow. Life at the ranch continued, the quiet rhythm of their days now underscored by a new, deeper connection. The words between them remained few, but their shared glances, the comfortable silences, and the small, unconscious ways they moved around each other spoke of a bond that had been forged in adversity and tempered in defiance. It was a love affair of the hands, not the lips, in the way she mended his shirt, the way he built her a better stool, the way they worked together to bring in the last of the hay before the first snow. The wind that finally blew was hot and dry, a malevolent breath from the south that was entirely out of season. For 3 days it howled through the canyons and across the plains, sucking the last of the moisture from the cured autumn grasses, turning the entire landscape into a tinderbox. The sky took on a sickly yellow-brown haze, and the air crackled with a dry, electric tension. "Don't like this wind," Martha grumbled on the 3rd day, her old bones aching with a deep, primal unease. "It's a fire wind." Caleb, standing on the porch and staring south, said nothing. His face was grim. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. The ranch was their sanctuary, but it was also an island in a sea of dry grass, surrounded on 3 sides by the vast, unmanaged rangeland of Silas Croft's Circle C. The first sign of disaster came not as a sight, but as a scent, a faint, acrid smell of smoke, carried on the relentless wind. Mary Lou, who was drawing water from the well, stopped and lifted her head, her nostrils flaring like a nervous mare's. She looked toward Caleb, who was already moving, his body coiling with a sudden, urgent energy. "Get the wagon hitched, Martha," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the wind's howl. "Load it with every water barrel we have, and all the wet blankets you can find. Mary Lou, with me." He ran toward the barn, and she followed without hesitation. her heart beginning to pound a frantic, fearful rhythm against her ribs. From the rise behind the barn, they could see it. It was no longer just a scent. It was a visible, terrifying reality. A thick, roiling column of greasy black smoke was climbing into the hazy sky to the south, and, at its base, a brilliant, hungry line of orange flickered against the brown grass. The fire was on Circle C land, but with the wind driving it north at a terrifying speed, it would be on them in less than an hour. "The horses," Caleb said, his voice tight. "We have to get them out of the lower pasture and move them north to the rocky ground." Panic was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, but the sight of Caleb's focused calm was a steadying anchor. The next half hour was a blur of frantic, controlled activity. While Martha worked with a grim efficiency at the cabin, Caleb and Mary Lou rode out to the pasture where the main herd, nearly 30 horses, including several young, flighty colts, was grazing, their heads already up, their ears twitching at the smell of smoke. Driving the herd was like trying to contain chaos. The horses, their eyes rolling white with terror, were reluctant to move toward the smoke-choked horizon. Caleb rode like a man possessed, a seamless extension of his powerful dark horse, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through the animals' panic. Mary Lou, her own fear forgotten in the desperate need for action, rode the buckskin mare, working the flank of the herd, her skirts tucked up, her hair flying loose from its pins. She found a strength she never knew she possessed, her voice sharp and commanding as she turned a bolting colt back into the group. They were pushing the last of the herd through a narrow gap in a rock outcropping that led to the relative safety of a barren, stony rise, when the wind shifted with a violent, gusting roar. The fire responded, leaping forward with a sound like a freight train, a wall of flame and smoke suddenly cresting a nearby ridge. A young mare, wild with terror, broke from the herd, turning back toward the fire and the imagined safety of her familiar pasture. "No!" Caleb yelled. "Let her go!" But instinct, or perhaps a deep-seated love for the creatures in his care, drove him. He spurred his horse, cutting across the mare's path, trying to turn her back. The air was thick with smoke and flying embers. For a heart-stopping moment, he had her, his horse pressing against her flank, forcing her back toward the gap. And then it happened. Blinded by smoke, the terrified mare reared, lashing out with her front hooves. Caleb's horse shied violently, and in that split second of chaos, the mare's hind legs shot out in a powerful, desperate kick. It caught Caleb squarely on the lower leg with a sickening, audible crack. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and his body went limp in the saddle. He slumped to one side, his foot caught in the stirrup, as his horse, now frantic, bolted. "Caleb!" Mary Lou screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. She spurred the buckskin, racing after the runaway horse, her world narrowing to that one terrifying image, Caleb's body being dragged across the rocky ground. She caught up to them, grabbing for the reins, her fingers closing on the rough leather. She pulled with all her might, the buckskin straining as she brought the frantic horse to a halt. She leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped moving. Caleb was a crumpled heap on the ground. A deep gash on his temple was bleeding freely, and his left leg was bent at a horrifying, unnatural angle. He was unconscious. For a single, paralyzing moment, terror overwhelmed her. The roar of the fire was closer now, the heat a physical blow. She was alone. The man who had been her rock, her protector, was broken at her feet. She could run, she could save herself. And then, another thought, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. Cut through the panic, he would not have run. A new strength, fierce and absolute, surged through her. She was not the woman from Boston anymore. She was a woman of this place, and she would not abandon her own. Getting him onto the buckskin mare was a nightmare of adrenaline and desperate strength. He was a dead weight, and she sobbed with the effort, her muscles screaming as she somehow managed to haul his limp body across the saddle. She tied his hands loosely to the saddle horn to keep him from sliding off, then took the reins of both horses and began the slow, agonizing journey back to the cabin, leading them away from the advancing flames. Martha met them at the barn, her face a pale, grim mask. Together, they carried him inside and laid him on his own cot. The fire, by some miracle of a last-minute wind shift, had veered to the east, sparing the ranch itself, but the battle inside the cabin had just begun. Mary Lou became a general in a war against death. She sent Martha for clean water and bandages. With trembling hands, she cut away Caleb's trouser leg. The sight of the shattered bone beneath the bruised and swelling flesh made her feel faint, but she bit down on her lip until she tasted blood and forced the feeling away. She cleaned the gash on his head, her touch surprisingly gentle and sure. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow. All through that long, smoke-filled night, she sat beside him. She bathed his face, forced sips of water between his lips when he stirred and moaned, and kept a cool, damp cloth on his feverish head. Martha, her own fear hidden behind a stoic facade, helped as she could, but she seemed to look to Mary Lou for direction, a silent transfer of authority taking place in the dim, flickering lamplight. Mary Lou was no longer the hired help. She was the mistress of this house, fighting for the life of its master. By dawn, his fever had spiked and his breathing was ragged. Mary Lou knew, with a dreadful certainty, that her simple nursing was not enough. The leg needed to be set, and the head wound was deep. He needed a doctor. "I'm going to town," she announced to Martha, her voice raspy from smoke and exhaustion. "I'm bringing Doc Miller back here, whether he wants to come or not." "It's a 10-mile ride," Martha said, her eyes full of worry. "You're exhausted." "I'll make it," Mary Lou said, a hard resolve in her voice. "Watch him for me." She rode Caleb's own dark horse, the animal's long, powerful stride eating up the miles. She arrived in Redemption just as the town was beginning to stir, a wild, soot-stained figure on a lathered horse. She ignored the shocked stares, riding directly to the small house with a Dr. Miller sign swinging from a post. She found the doctor, a portly, irritable man, at his breakfast table. He listened to her breathless story with a frown. "A broken leg and a head injury. You say up at the Hart place?" He sighed. "That's a long way to ride, young lady, and I have patients here." "My patients are dying, Dr. Miller," a voice said from the doorway. Mary Lou turned. Silas Croft stood there, immaculately dressed, his face a mask of false concern. "I heard the terrible news," he said, stepping into the room. "A tragedy. I was just on my way to the Circle C to assess the fire damage. Of course, the flames started on my property due to some unfortunate carelessness by my men, but it seems poor Hart bore the brunt of it. Such a shame." The casual, insincere apology was more insulting than an open threat. "Doctor," Silas continued, placing a hand on Miller's shoulder, "you must go. A man's life is at stake. I will, of course, cover all your expenses. Consider it a neighborly gesture." He turned his attention to Mary Lou, his eyes cold and reptilian. "And, Miss Bennett, you must be overwhelmed. In his incapacitated state, Hart will be unable to manage his affairs. Perhaps he would be interested in selling his small operation. The Circle C could absorb it, and I would, of course, offer a generous price. It would relieve him of his burden, and yours." It was a vulture's offer, a move to capitalize on tragedy, to kick a man when he was down. The entire town, it seemed, was listening from the street. This was the final test. Mary Lou looked him square in the eye, her own eyes blazing with a cold fire that made his falter. Mr. Hart's affairs," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that shocked everyone, including herself, "are in my hands, his honor is in my hands, and his ranch is not for sale." She turned to the doctor. You are coming with me, Doctor, now. And if Mr. Croft's generosity is not enough to persuade you, then know this, I am not asking." She turned and strode out of the house, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She had not only tended to Caleb's wounds, she had taken up his sword. She had faced down the town's most powerful man and defended their home, their life, their future, standing on the dusty street of redemption, waiting for the doctor to gather his things. She was no longer an outsider. She was the woman from the Hart Ranch, and she was not afraid. The ride back to the ranch with Doc Miller was a grim, silent affair. The doctor, a man accustomed to the neat, contained ailments of the town, was clearly unnerved by the wildness of the landscape and the raw severity of Caleb's injuries. But Mary Lou's fierce, unyielding demeanor left him no room to protest. He worked with a surprising gentleness, his pudgy fingers surprisingly deft as he cleaned the head wound and began the agonizing process of setting Caleb's leg. Mary Lou and Martha assisted, their faces pale in the lantern light, handing him bandages, boiling water, and holding Caleb steady when his unconscious body twitched in a spasm of pain. The sharp, clean snap as the bone was forced back into alignment was a sound that would haunt Mary Lou's dreams. The doctor applied a rough splint, bound it tightly, and then administered a dose of laudanum that plunged Caleb into a deep, drugged sleep. "He's strong," Miller said, wiping his brow as he packed his bag. "That's in his favor, but the next few days will tell the tale. Keep him quiet, keep the head wound clean, and pray the fever breaks." He looked at Mary Lou, his gaze holding a new, grudging respect. "Your quick thinking likely saved his life. As for the other business," he shook his head, "you've made a powerful enemy. Young woman." "The enemy was made long before today, Doctor," she replied quietly. Silas Croft's predatory offer echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper against the backdrop of Caleb's ragged breathing. It was not enough for him to see Caleb ruined. He wanted to own the rubble. The thought filled her not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying rage. The days that followed were a testament to her endurance. She and Martha ran the ranch, their shared worry a silent bond between them. Mary Lou did the work of two men, her body fueled by a desperate, protective energy. She fed and watered the stock, mucked out the stalls, and managed the 100 other tasks that kept the ranch alive. And every few hours, she was back at Caleb's bedside, changing his bandages, spooning broth and water between his cracked lips, and speaking to him in a low, soothing voice, willing him to return to her. News from the town arrived with a rancher who came to buy a horse, his errand a thin excuse to satisfy his curiosity. A town meeting had been called. The official topic, according to the notice posted by Silas Croft, was rangeland safety and fire prevention in the wake of the recent catastrophe. But everyone knew the true agenda. It was to be a public trial, with Silas as the prosecutor and judge, and the absent Caleb Hart as the defendant. "You can't go," Martha insisted that evening, her voice tight with worry. "It's a trap, girl. He'll tear you to pieces in front of everyone." "If I don't go, he wins," Mary Lou said, looking at Caleb's still, pale face. His fever had not yet broken. "He will tell them whatever lies he wishes, and there will be no one to speak the truth. He will paint Caleb as reckless and me as a burden. He will use their fear of another fire to turn them against this ranch for good. This isn't about me anymore. Martha, it's about his name. It's about our home." The word hung in the air, simple and profound. On the afternoon of the meeting, she heated water and washed herself clean of the grime of the barn. She did not put on the hopeful blue calico dress. Instead, she chose her plainest, most practical work dress, the dark gray wool she had patched and mended herself. She brushed her hair and pinned it back in a severe, simple knot. There would be no artifice, no pretense. She would face them as what she was, a working woman, the acting head of the Hart Ranch. As she was about to leave, she stood for a moment by Caleb's cot. He was stirring, his eyes fluttering beneath his lids. She reached out and took his hand, It was hot and dry, but his fingers feebly curled around hers. "I'll be back," she whispered, her voice thick. "I promise." She rode the buckskin mare into redemption, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward. When she entered the town hall, the room was already packed, the air thick and tense. It fell silent as she walked in, the only sound the soft thud of her boots on the wooden floor. She ignored the whispers and the hostile stares from Mrs. Parker and her clique. She found a spot along the back wall and stood there, her hands folded before her, a solitary island of calm in a sea of agitation. Silas Croft stood at the front of the room, beside the mare. He looked polished and authoritative, a concerned landowner leading his community. He had already begun to speak, his voice resonating with false sincerity. A tragedy that could have been avoided, he was saying. While the fire did originate on my land, due to the regrettable carelessness of some new hands, its rapid spread toward the Hart property raises questions. Questions of responsible grazing, of fire breaks. A smaller, less professionally managed outfit can, through no fault of its own, pose a risk to us all. He was masterful, turning his own culpability into a question of Caleb's competence. He was poisoning the well, planting the seeds of fear and resentment. This is not a matter for women. The voice of Elisha Parker, Silas's partner, cut through the room as some of the men began to murmur their agreement. "Miss Bennett, with all due respect, your presence here is inappropriate." This was the moment. Mary Lou took a slow breath and stepped forward from the shadows of the back wall into the center of the aisle. "My presence here is the only thing that is appropriate. Mr. Parker," she said, her voice not loud, but so clear and steady that it commanded the attention of every person in the room. "As Mr. Hart is unable to be here to defend his good name, I will do it for him." Silas shot her a look of pure venom. "This is a discussion for landowners. Miss Bennett, a title you do not hold." "I hold his trust," she retorted, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of the ranchers, the blacksmith, the stable owner. "And that is a title I value more than any piece of paper. You all know me as the woman who was left at the train station. You have whispered about me, judged me, and dismissed me. And that is your right. But what you do not know is the man you are allowing Mr. Croft to slander." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You speak of risk. Let me speak of character. I have seen the character of Caleb Hart. It is in the patience he shows a frightened colt. It is in the honest price he charges for an honest horse. It is in the way he stood up for me when I had no one. And it was in the courage that drove him into a wall of fire to save his animals, an act that nearly cost him his life." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed on, her passion a palpable force. "And what of Mr. Croft's character? His character was in the neighborly offer to buy this ranch from a man he believed to be on his deathbed. His character is in his attempt today to use a disaster that began on his own land to ruin a smaller neighbor. Do not let him sell you fear and call it public safety. He is selling you his own private greed and calling it community standards." A new, uncertain murmur rippled through the crowd. She had turned the argument from land management to a question of morality, and it was a question that made many of them uncomfortable. "These are the unsubstantiated claims of a desperate woman," Silas boomed, trying to regain control. "She has no proof, only bitter accusations." "She has me." The voice was weak, raspy, but it cut through the hall like a blade. Every head turned toward the doorway. Caleb Hart stood there, leaning heavily on a rough-hewn crutch, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Martha Riley stood beside him, her arm supporting his elbow, her face a mixture of fierce pride and deep anxiety. He had defied the doctor, defied his fever, defied the agony in his leg, and had somehow made it into town. His splinted leg was thrust out before him, a testament to the price he had paid. His presence was a thunderclap in the tense room. He hobbled forward, each step an obvious effort, his eyes burning with fever and resolve, fixed on Silas Croft. He did not go to the front. Instead, he moved to stand beside Mary Lou, a silent, powerful affirmation of their unity. He put his free arm around her shoulders, a gesture of support that was also a clear statement of ownership and protection. "I'm here," he said, his voice gaining a little strength as he addressed the stunned crowd, "to answer any questions you might have about my operation." Silas was momentarily flummoxed. He had counted on Caleb being absent, unable to defend himself. This spectral, defiant appearance had shattered his narrative. "Hart, you should be in bed," the mayor stammered. "My place is here," Caleb said simply. His gaze fell upon the 2 Circle C hands Silas had with him, the same men who had been with him during the confrontation weeks before. Caleb's fever-bright eyes narrowed. "I have a question myself. For your men, Croft, they say a man gets careless with a fire when he's in a hurry. What were you in such a hurry to do on my border that day?" The 2 men shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet his gaze. A heavy, expectant silence filled the hall. The townspeople were leaning forward, their faces a mixture of suspicion and fascination. They had come for a simple condemnation. They were getting a high-stakes drama. It was then that a new voice spoke, a slow, deep baritone from the side of the room. They weren't in a hurry. They were drunk. Jebediah, the blacksmith, rose to his feet. He was a large, solid man whose opinion carried weight. He was known for his honesty and his quiet nature. When he spoke, people listened. "I was closing up shop," Jebediah said, his gaze fixed on Silas. "Saw your 2 boys right out of the saloon. They were bragging, said the boss had sent them to smoke out the squatter, said they were going to run a little fire along his fence line, just to give him a scare." A collective gasp went through the room. "It's a lie," one of the hands blurted out, his face pale with fear. "Is it?" Jebediah countered, his voice like iron. "Because you left your whiskey bottle on my anvil, and you were complaining that Croft was too cheap to pay you what a real risky job was worth. Sound familiar?" The color drained from Silas Croft's face. He looked at his men, his eyes blazing with fury, but their terrified, guilty faces were a clear confession. The entire room turned to look at him, the whispers now turning into a low, angry growl. He had not just been careless, he had been malicious. He had deliberately endangered them all, their homes, their livestock, their families, all to settle a petty, personal score. His power, which had been built on a carefully constructed facade of wealth and respectability, crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. The mayor took a step away from him. "Mrs." Parker stared, her mouth agape in horror, finally seeing the ugly reality behind the polished veneer she had so admired. Silas Croft stood alone, exposed and utterly defeated. Without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the suddenly hostile crowd, a man fleeing his own disgrace. In the ensuing quiet, Caleb leaned heavily on Mary Lou, a wave of dizziness from his fever and exertion washing over him. The townspeople began to approach them, not with suspicion, but with a new, profound respect in their eyes. Henderson, the livery owner, clapped Caleb gently on the shoulder. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had previously snubbed Mary Lou, now offered her a small, hesitant smile. They had not just witnessed a confrontation, they had witnessed the triumph of integrity over influence, of character over coin. They had looked at Mary Lou and seen a woman of courage. They had looked at Caleb and seen a man of honor. And in the way they stood together, supporting each other against the world, the people of Redemption finally saw something they could understand and, at long last, respect a partnership, as strong and true as the land itself. The winter that followed the fire was a time of healing, a quiet, snowbound season of recovery. Silas Croft, stripped of his manufactured authority and facing the cold contempt of the very people he had tried to manipulate, sold his holdings at a loss to a cattle consortium from Santa Fe and vanished from the territory. His departure was as unlamented as the melting of a spring snowdrift, leaving behind only the faint, sour memory of his ambition. Caleb's body mended slowly. The fever broke after 3 long days, leaving him weak but lucid. For weeks, he was confined to his cot, his splinted leg a constant, aching reminder of the fire. The enforced stillness was a torment for a man accustomed to perpetual motion, but it was a crucible that forged a new kind of intimacy between him and Mary Lou. She was his constant companion, his nurse, his partner in running the ranch. She read to him from one of the worn books she'd brought from Boston. She changed his bandages with a touch that was both gentle and professional. She brought him his meals and listened as he, a man of so few words, began to share stories of his life on the trail, of stampedes under stormy skies and quiet nights spent staring at these same stars. He spoke, and she listened, and in the quiet confines of the fire-lit cabin, the last of the walls between them crumbled away. He, in turn, watched her. He saw the quiet strength with which she managed the ranch, the way she spoke to the horses, the determined set of her jaw as she hauled water through the deepening snow. He saw the woman who had faced down his enemy and defended his honor when he could not. His admiration, which had been a quiet, growing thing, blossomed into a love as deep and solid as the mountains that framed their home. As the snows began to recede and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the damp earth, Caleb was back on his feet, leaning on a cane, but his strength returning daily. It was during this time that Mary Lou made a decision. She had found a home, but she had also discovered a fierce need for a place in the world that was entirely her own. "I'm going to open a shop in town," she announced one evening as they sat by the fire. Caleb looked up from the bridle he was mending, his gray eyes searching her face. "You don't have to," he said, his voice quiet. "This is your home. Everything I have is—" "I know," she interrupted gently, a soft smile on her lips. "And I am not leaving, but this is something I need to do for myself. I am a seamstress. Caleb, it's a skill I possess. I want to use it, to build something of my own." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the same resolve that had carried her across a continent and through a fire. He understood. It wasn't about money, or leaving him. It was about standing on her own 2 feet, not as a dependent, but as a partner. "All right, Mary Lou," he said, a slow smile spreading across his own face. "What do you need?" With a small loan from Caleb, which she insisted on documenting as a formal business debt, she leased the small, abandoned dressmaker's shop at the end of town, the very one she had passed on her first desperate day, with the sad, faded bonnet in the window. The transformation of the little shop became a town affair. Jebediah, the blacksmith, forged her a new, elegant sign that read, "Amel Bennett, Seamstress and Fine Needlework." Henderson, the livery owner, whose wife needed a new dress for a wedding, provided the lumber to build shelves and a proper counter. Even Mrs. Parker, in a remarkable act of public penance, came by with her 2 daughters, commissioning 3 new Sunday dresses and speaking loudly to anyone who would listen about Miss Bennett's impeccable taste and remarkable skill. Mary Lou's shop flourished. She offered more than just mending. She had a keen eye for fabric and a knowledge of Eastern styles that the women of redemption, long starved for a touch of elegance, eagerly embraced. She made sturdy riding skirts for ranchers' wives, delicate christening gowns for new babies, and handsome new shirts for cowboys who wanted to impress their sweethearts. Her hands were rarely still. The shop became a quiet hub, a place where women could gather, not to gossip and judge, but to talk of patterns and children and the small triumphs of their lives. Mary Lou, the outcast, had become the town's confidant and creator of beautiful things. She had found her place, not by being given one, but by carving it out with her own needle and thread. She still lived at the ranch, riding into town each morning and returning as the sun began to dip low, her day's earnings carefully noted in her ledger. The ride home was the best part of her day, a slow journey back to the quiet peace of the hills, back to the man who would be waiting for her. One evening in late summer, She returned to find Caleb sitting on the porch steps, watching the horizon. His cane was gone. Leaning against the wall beside him, his legs still had a slight stiffness, but he walked with the familiar, easy grace she had first seen months ago. The ranch was quiet. The horses settled for the night, the air cooling as the sun began its spectacular descent. She sat on the step beside him, leaning her head back against the porch post with a weary sigh. He didn't speak, but reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a comfortable, familiar gesture, as natural as breathing. They sat in silence for a long time, watching as the setting sun painted the vast, empty prairie in breathtaking strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. The sky was immense, the land stretching out before them, and in the face of such grandeur, words felt small and unnecessary. "I used to think this was the loneliest place on earth," Caleb said finally, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. Mary Lou looked at him. "And now," he said, turning his head to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. "It's just quiet. It feels like home." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "You made it a home, Mary Lou?" Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back, a happy warmth spreading through her chest. "I came here looking for a home," she said, her voice a near whisper. "A man promised me one in letters. He promised me a future, all neatly planned out." She looked out at the spectacular, wild sunset. He was wrong. A home isn't something someone can promise you in a letter. It isn't something that's just waiting for you. You have to build it with your own 2 hands, out of whatever life gives you. She squeezed his hand. "We built this, Caleb, out of dust and disappointment and fire. We built it together." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture more eloquent than 1,000 flowery words. It was a kiss of partnership, of respect, of a love that had been tested and proven true. They sat there until the last sliver of the sun disappeared and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. There was no grand proposal, no promises of an easy future. The West did not deal in such certainties. There would be other struggles, other hardships, droughts, hard winters, the simple, grinding work of survival. But they would face it all as they had faced everything else together. This was not a perfect storybook ending. It was something far better. It was a solid, unshakable beginning, a love as quiet, as resilient, and as vast as the Western land itself. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. For extra support, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.